The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent the way a candle goes out in a draught, a flicker, a held breath, and then the darkness settling before anyone could say with certainty that the light had ever been there. One moment, the Harwick assembly room was full of the ordinary noise of a county reception. The scrape of chairs, the low music from the quartet in the alcove, the polite percussion of cutlery against china. And then Miss Cecily Rowe walked to the center of the floor. And the noise stopped. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She was 23 years old, and slight as a winter reed, wearing a cream gown with a pale green sash that her aunt had twice remarked was too plain for an occasion of this sort. Her honey-brown hair was dressed simply, a single loose curl at the nape of her neck. She wore white gloves, freshly pressed, and her hands were perfectly steady as she crossed the floor. In her right hand she held a ring. A fine one, an emerald, set in gold, the Ashford betrothal piece that had been in the family for 4 generations. In her left hand she held an envelope. A letter, its seal already broken. A pale blue ribbon tied through the ring so that the 2 items arrived, together, unmistakably bound. The Earl of Harwick stood at the far end of the room. He was 34 years old, and tall enough that she could see him over the heads of the people, turning to follow her progress across the floor. His face, as she approached, was very still. His dark navy tailcoat was immaculate. His gray eyes, beneath the strong brow with its faint scar at the left temple, watched her come and did not look away. He did not reach for the item she was carrying. He did not speak. She set the ring and the letter on the table beside him. She did not meet his eyes. She stepped back. The room waited. He said nothing. She turned and walked out. What she did not know, in that moment, was that the letter in the envelope was not the letter anyone in the room believed it to be. What she did not know was that the woman who had placed it in her hands 20 minutes earlier, in the anteroom, with eyes full of calculated sympathy, had known exactly what it would do. What she did not know was that across the county, in a house she had never visited, a woman named Dorothea Fenn had written that letter in the desperation of a February morning, and that the man the letter was addressed to had never received it, had never known it existed, had walked into this assembly tonight entirely unprepared for what was sitting waiting on that table. None of that was visible in the room. What the room saw was a clergyman's daughter returning a ring. What the room chose to remember was the steadiness of her hands. She had been steady for a long time. It was what she knew how to do. She had been steadying herself since the October morning 3 years prior, when her father, the Reverend George Rowe, had sat down in his study chair after the morning service and not got up again. He was 58 years old, and had been the vicar of St. T. Mary's in the village of Ashcroft for 22 years, and he had left behind him a small stone cottage on church land, 2 daughters, a library of annotated books, and debts that his salary had never quite managed to outrun. The debts were not large, by a gentleman's measure. They were considerable by a clergyman's daughter's. He had been a good man, her father. Not a clever one, in the worldly sense, and not a provident one, and he had been constitutionally unable to refuse a parishioner who needed something he could provide, and the something was more often than not money he did not have and a loan that was never repaid. He had known this about himself and was not precisely ashamed of it, only occasionally apologetic in the way of a man who has examined his own accounting and found it wanting, but cannot alter the ledger of his character. He had loved his daughters with the uncomplicated warmth of a man who did not distinguish between his 2 children, on the basis of beauty or accomplishment or likeliness to make a good match. He had read to them from the same books he used for his sermons. He had expected them to think. Cecily had thought. She had thought clearly and consistently, and the result of her thinking, by the time she was 17, was that she understood with some precision the gap between her situation and what the world generally required of a clergyman's daughter who wished to marry above her father's income. She was not unbeautiful. She was not without intelligence or address. She was without the one thing that the equation required, which was money. and she had looked at this fact steadily and decided, very early, that steadiness itself was her only reliable resource. Her elder sister Harriet had married well 2 years before their father's death, to a solicitor in Bath, a kind man, with a steady income and a house large enough to take in his wife's family if necessary, which was what he quietly made clear he would do when the letter came about the Reverend's death. Cecily spent 6 months in Bath. She was grateful for the kindness, and she was also acutely, privately aware of what it cost Harriet's husband to host an indefinite guest. And she resolved, without announcing the resolution, to be as little a burden as possible and to find her own situation. It was her uncle, Mr. Philip Thorne, who managed it, her mother's brother, a solicitor himself, a man who moved in circles somewhat above his professional station by dint of careful cultivation, and a wife whose family had money. He had come to Bath in January with a proposal, and the word he used was exactly that, a proposal which was the polite form for what it actually was, which was an arrangement. The Earl of Harwick had been widowed 3 years. He had a young ward, his niece Clara, who required a woman's influence in the household. He was 34 years old and not inclined toward another love match. He was prepared to offer a respectable establishment, a generous allowance, and the security of his name. He wished for a woman of good character and some education. Mr. Thorne had spoken well of his niece. Cecily had listened to all of this in the sitting room of Harriet's house, with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed. She had asked 3 questions. She had been given 3 answers that were substantially accurate. She had said she would think about it. She thought about it for 4 days. She thought about her father's annotated Bible, which she had taken with her from the cottage, the one with his handwriting in the margins. On the inside cover he had written, in the year of her parents' marriage, a line that she had memorized without trying: "Choose with your whole heart, or not at all, for half a heart is cold comfort in a cold world." She had thought about that line for 4 days, and then she had told her uncle, yes. She told herself it was practical. She did not tell herself it was anything else. She was 22 years old. She was educated and capable, and she was a clergyman's daughter with £112 in the bank, and no reasonable prospects. The Earl of Harwick was not asking her for a love match. He was asking for what she could honestly give: her presence, her competence, her respectability. She could give those things. She did not think she was deceiving anyone. What she had not anticipated was the estate. She had expected a great house to be cold. She had expected the Earl to be remote, which he was. She had expected his ward Clara to be shy of her, which Clara was, for exactly 4 days, and then was not. What she had not expected was the library, 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling shelves, a fire perpetually burning, afternoon light falling through the south window at exactly the angle that made reading possible without a candle until nearly 4 o'clock. What she had not expected was Clara. The child was 8 years old and serious in the way of children who have been left largely to themselves. She had dark curls and pale skin, and a habit of watching adults' faces with the still attention of someone who had learned that faces said more than words. She wore white day dresses with a pale blue sash, and she had a particular way of holding a book, 2-handed, with the spine resting against her small sternum, that reminded Cecily so acutely of her father that she had to look away the first time she saw it. Clara had lost her own parents in a carriage accident when she was 4. The Earl was her guardian by default, the only male relative of appropriate age and station. He was not unkind to her. He was also, Cecily observed during the first weeks of her courtship visits, almost entirely at a loss before the child's emotional interior, which was deep and required tending. He could ensure she had the correct tutors. He could not, or would not, sit on the floor of the nursery and tell her stories until the storm outside stopped. Being frightening, the storm was in the 2nd week of March. Cecily had come to Ashford Park for the afternoon, the courtship visits being formal and chaperoned, and lasting approximately 2.5 hours. And the weather had come down hard at 3:30, the kind of late winter squall that turned the roads to rivers. The housekeeper, Mrs. Platt, had taken the maid and the footman down to deal with a flooding in the lower corridor. The Earl's own groom had gone to see to the horses. Cecily had heard Clara's voice from the nursery, not crying, which would have been more legible, but that particular silence that is worse than crying, and had gone in. She read to the child for an hour. She did not choose a lesson book. She chose the book Clara had been holding, which was a collection of natural history with illustrations of birds, and she read it aloud in the voice she had used when her father's congregation included children in the front pew, unhurried, with room for questions. Clara asked 4 questions. Cecily answered all of them as precisely as she knew how. She did not know the Earl was standing in the doorway. She did not know until she turned to find the next illustration and saw his reflection in the dark window glass beside her, the fire behind him, his face still and his gray eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not name and did not try to. He stepped back when she turned. He said that Mrs. Platt had reported the flooding contained, and that the storm was clearing to the south, and that he had arranged for the carriage to be brought round. His voice was level. His hands were at his sides. She said Clara was asking about the kingfisher. There was a picture of one. He said, "Yes, there is a pair of them on the east bank of the stream. In summer." Clara looked up at this and said nothing, but she looked at her guardian with the face of someone receiving unexpected information. He left the room. It was the first of a series of small adjustments she began to notice. After that afternoon, the kind of adjustments that could each individually be attributed to the competent management of a household. The fire in the library was always burning when she arrived. One morning, she came in to find that the chair by the south window had been repositioned 3 inches to the left, which was exactly where it needed to be for the afternoon light to fall at the right angle, and she had not mentioned this to anyone. A footman brought tea at 4 o'clock on her second visit in March without being summoned, and the tea was precisely the temperature she preferred, which was warmer than most people served it. She had not commented on this either. There was an afternoon when she had walked the path along the east garden in a light March rain, because she had wanted air and the rain had come on suddenly, and the Earl had appeared at the garden door before she had taken 20 steps and said, "Come inside," in the tone of a man issuing instructions to his steward, not asking her question. She had been irritated by it, the presumption, the command, the implication that she could not be trusted to manage a light rain, and she had said so precisely and without heat, standing in the garden with the rain on her shoulders. He had looked at her for a moment, then he had said, "The path is uneven past the yew hedge. Mrs. Platt's girl turned her ankle there last month. She had come inside." She had stood in the entrance hall and been aware of the specific shape of what had just happened, which was that he had given her a reason which was not what men of his rank were generally in the habit of providing. She had not known what to do with that, so she had done nothing with it, which was the correct practical response, and not at all the response her body was most inclined toward, which was to stand in the entrance hall and pay closer attention to the way his coat fit his shoulders when he turned to hang her damp shawl on the hook by the door. He did not know, as he left the room, what it cost him to leave it. He did not have language for what he had seen from the doorway, which was not a governess managing a difficult child, but something that had the quality of his own life from before, the particular warmth of a woman reading in firelight, unhurried, fully present. His wife Eleanor had read like that. He had not seen it since. He stood in the corridor for longer than was necessary. He had been a different sort of man before. Eleanor died, he had been capable of ordinary warmth. He had been capable of sitting in a room with another person and feeling that the room was better for it. 3 years of the estate and the ledgers and the ward, he did not know how to reach, had contracted something in him, not broken, but compressed, the way grief compresses everything it touches into the smallest possible space where it can still function. He had been careful. He had been careful about everything. The arrangement with Mrs. Fenn had been, in his mind, contained a practical consideration between adults, concluded before the formal engagement, not spoken of and not resumed. He had ended it the evening he decided to send his man to speak with Philip Thorne, because he had sat in the library with a glass of port and thought about the way Cecily Rowe held her spine at a formal introduction, and felt for the first time in 3 years that a choice in front of him might be made with something other than ledger logic. He had not told anyone this. He was not a man who spoke about the contents of his own chest. Eleanor's portrait hung in the upper gallery, opposite the south window. Clara had taken Cecily there on the third courtship visit, with the proprietary pride of a child sharing something important. The portrait was oil, 3/4 length, done the year before Eleanor's death, showing a fair woman of 26 with steady brown eyes, and a composed expression, and the slight forward lean of someone accustomed to listening. Clara had said simply, "That is my Aunt Eleanor. She was kind." Cecily had said, "Yes, I can see that." She had not heard the Earl come up behind them. She did not know he was there until she felt the quality of Clara's attention shift, and she turned to find him 3 feet away, looking at the portrait. His face, normally composed, had done something she could not name. He said nothing. After a moment, Clara put her hand in his, which was a thing she had perhaps not done before, judging by the fractional hesitation in his hand's response. Then he folded his fingers around his wards and stood there and looked at his dead wife's eyes. That was when Cecily understood what it had cost him to be the kind of man he now was. Not brutality, not coldness for its own sake. Grief's long work, reshaping a person from the outside, in until the original shape was only visible in moments like this one, when something broke through the compressed surface. She should have been safer for knowing. She was not. It was Lady Sophia Pembridge who gave her the letter. Lady Sophia was 26 and the daughter of a viscount, and she had been the assumed frontrunner for the Earl of Harwick's second marriage for approximately 2 years before he made his arrangement with Cecily's uncle. She was tall and auburn-haired and wore ice-blue gowns and sapphire brooches and moved through a room with the absolute assurance of a woman who had never been told her categories were wrong. She was not cruel in the coarse sense. She was precise. She identified the point of least resistance and applied force there, and she did it with an expression of perfect social warmth. She had been precise about Cecily from the first. It was at the milliner's in Harwick in late February that Lady Sophia had spoken to her companion about the engagement within audible range of Cecily and Miss Jane Appleton, Cecily's one real friend in the county. Lady Sophia had not lowered her voice. "A clergyman's daughter," she had said in the tone of someone completing a sentence that had begun some time ago. "One supposes he required something manageable. Harwick is not known for sentiment." Cecily had heard this. She had said nothing. She had looked at a ribbon she did not intend to purchase. The Dowager Lady Harwick, the Earl's widowed aunt, who had been managing the social dimensions of the estate since Eleanor's death, had been more direct. Cecily had encountered her at the estate in early March, arriving for an afternoon visit to find the older woman already in the drawing room, waiting with the particular stillness of someone who has prepared remarks. She had a fine face, lined and certain, and she wore deep violet, and regarded Cecily with the appraising attention of someone assessing a piece of furniture of uncertain provenance. "My nephew has made an unconventional choice," she had said, setting down her cup with the careful precision of a woman who does not fidget. "A clergyman's daughter, at his rank, raises questions. I trust you are aware of that." She had said it without cruelty, which was what made it stay. The morning before the assembly, Miss Jane Appleton had come to Cecily's uncle's house with the particular expression of a good person who is delivering information they wish they did not have. She sat in the small parlor and said, with her eyes steady on the window, that she had heard it again. Last evening, at the Carraway dinner, a remark from Mrs. Barclay, Carraway's sister, a woman who modeled her opinions on whatever Lady Sophia had most recently expressed, that it was odd, was it not, that the Earl had settled on a clergyman's daughter when there were women of far greater eligibility who had shown real interest. She said it twice. Jane said quietly, "I thought you should know what is being said." Cecily had thanked her. She had said she was aware of it. She had not told Jane that the remark, by that point, had the quality of a thing she had already made a kind of peace with. She had not thought she was loved. She had not expected to be. She had expected to be useful and adequate, and she had found herself instead reading to a child in a storm and looking at a dead woman's portrait, and sitting in the library with the fire burning. And she had noticed that the Earl always ensured the fire was burning in the library before she arrived, which was not a thing she had asked for, and was not a thing she had been told to expect. She had not told anyone how much that had come to matter. Lady Sophia found her in the anteroom of the assembly rooms 20 minutes before the formal reception was to begin. The room was busy enough for privacy. A dozen people milling, coats being collected, hair being checked in the mirror near the door. Lady Sophia had come to her side, with the unhurried grace of someone with nothing to apologize for, and had placed the letter in her hand with a murmur about misdirected correspondence, and she was so sorry. Had this arrived at the wrong address? She thought it might be important. The letter was addressed, in a woman's hand, to the Earl of Harwick. The seal was already broken. The date at the top was the 14th of January. Cecily read it twice. She was not the kind of person who let her face say everything. Her body was doing. Her face said nothing. Her hands were steady. She read the letter a second time to be certain she had understood it, and she had understood it entirely the first time, and she folded it, and she picked up the card from beside the anteroom mirror, and she untied the ribbon from her own hair, the pale blue one she had put there that evening, and she wrapped it through her ring until the ring and the letter were bound together. She thought about her father's handwriting. She thought about the phrase her father had written, "Choose with your whole heart or not at all." She had thought she was choosing practically. She had thought she was choosing with her eyes open. She had thought that a man who remembered to light the library fire before she arrived was, perhaps, capable of a kind of quiet regard that was worth something. Not love, in the novel sense, but something that might, given sufficient time and mutual good faith, become its own kind of warmth. She had not chosen with her whole heart. She had chosen with her whole calculation, which was what she had thought was sufficient. The letter told her it was not sufficient. The letter told her what kind of man she was proposing to spend her life beside, and what she was worth to him in the private hierarchy of his choices. And she understood, reading it a second time, that she had been the manageable option in a practical negotiation, and that this had been apparent to everyone in the county for some time. She walked into the assembly room and returned the ring. The weeks that followed were not quiet. They were not violent. They had the particular character of social damage, which is not loud, but which rearranges every room a person walks into. Her uncle was stricken, and then bewildered, and then when she explained only that the engagement was concluded and she would say nothing further, quietly and helplessly furious. He was a man who believed that situations could be managed by the correct application of reason, and he could find no purchase on a niece who had made up her mind and would not unmake it. She wrote to Harriet. She wrote briefly and factually, as was her habit, and she said that she was well, and that the engagement had been dissolved, and that she had already arranged an alternative situation, which she would write more about when it was settled. Then she sat for 3 days, and wrote to Mrs. Cordelia Whitwell, an elderly widow of 71, who lived in the village of Fenwick, 12 miles from Harwick, who had written twice to Cecily's uncle, inquiring after a reliable companion for the winter months. Cecily had seen the letters. She had noted the address. She wrote to Mrs. Whitwell with a directness that she later thought might have given a less sensible person pause, and Mrs. Bree. Whitwell wrote back within the week to say she was exactly the sort of woman she had been looking for, and when could she come? She packed her trunk. She packed her father's Bible last, and she held it for a moment before she placed it in the trunk, the worn leather cover, with its annotations barely visible at the edges of the pages where her father had pressed them most often. On the inside cover, his handwriting. She put it in the trunk. She did not cry. She had been steady for a long time. She was still steady. She told herself this was the same as being whole. Mrs. Moore. Whitwell's house in Fenwick was a moderate-sized stone manor that smelled of beeswax and old paper, and Mrs. Whitwell herself was a woman of 71 with a gimlet mind and a thorough disinterest in pretense. She had been widowed for 12 years. She had 3 adult children who visited. with reliable infrequency. She kept a great number of books, and a small dog named Murchison, and she played piquet with the concentration of a military strategist. She told Cecily on the afternoon of her arrival that she required a companion who could think and converse, and who did not simper, and that she was prepared to pay a fair wage for such a person, and had not found one in 2 years of looking. Cecily said she could converse and did not simper. Mrs. Whitwell said good and poured the tea, and that was the extent of their interview. The days at Fenwick were not unhappy. They had a regularity that Cecily found, to her surprise, steadying in a way that had nothing to do with the situation from which she had come. She read aloud in the evenings. She wrote Mrs. Whitwell's letters, which were numerous and brisk, and she played piquet without losing every game, which Mrs. Whitwell said was the first encouraging sign. She walked in the morning, alone, on the lane that ran east from the manor toward the water meadows, and she did not think about the east bank of a stream in Ashcroft where there were kingfishers in summer. She did not allow herself to think about the library. She did not allow herself to think about Clara holding the bird book with both hands. She did not allow herself to think about whether he had tried to explain, because thinking about whether he had tried to explain was the beginning of a conversation she could not finish, and she was not in a position to begin conversations she could not finish. He had not in fact tried to explain, not that night, not in the days that followed. He had stood in the assembly room for 30 seconds after she left, with the ring and the letter on the table beside him, and then he had picked up the letter and read it, and then he had stood very still for a moment longer. He had not, until that evening, known the letter existed. He had not, in 3 years of thinking very carefully about how to manage every variable of his life, considered the possibility that Mrs. Fenn might have written. He had ended the arrangement with perfect correctness. He had written to her personally, not through a third party, and said that he was making other arrangements, and that the connection was concluded, and he had been generous in the practical sense because he was not a cruel man, and he was careful to be fair. He had not considered that she might have written again. He had not thought about it because he had been thinking about other things, about a woman reading natural history to a child in a storm, about a fire in a library, about the way someone could hold their spine at a formal introduction and give the impression of complete self-possession while clearly wearing gloves that were a little too small. He read the letter a second time and understood what had happened. He understood the date. He understood the handwriting. He understood that the seal had been broken by someone who was not him. He looked around the room. He did not see Lady Sophia Pembridge. He did not need to. He could have gone after her. He had stood in the assembly room and known that he could have walked to the door and followed and explained, and he had not done it, because he was the Earl of Harwick, and he was 34 years old, and he had spent 3 years operating on the principle that the correct response to every difficult situation was containment. He had stood there and contained it, which was the most catastrophic decision he would make in a year of catastrophic decisions, and he had known it was a catastrophe while he was making it, and he had made it anyway. He spent the following 6 days in the library. He spent them reading nothing. He sat in the chair by the fire, in the room where the fire was always burning by the time she arrived, and he looked at the south window, and he thought about what it felt like to have been within reach of something, and to have stood still while it walked out the door. On the 7th day he summoned his solicitor. Mrs. Fenn's attorney was a man named Colwell in the market town of Linfield, 9 miles east. The Earl's solicitor wrote to Colwell. Colwell wrote back within 5 days. The arrangement had indeed been concluded in January. Mrs. Fenn had written the letter on the 14th without informing Colwell she intended to do so. Colwell had not been aware of any subsequent correspondence. He was prepared to provide a dated affidavit to this effect, signed and sealed, to any interested party. The Earl held the affidavit in his hands for a long time. He thought about what the affidavit was. It was correct and precise and entirely legal, and it contained the truth about a sequence of events, and it was the kind of thing the Earl of Harwick was very good at producing and presenting, and it was not On its own, sufficient. He knew what was sufficient. He had known for some time. He was not a man who found it easy to say what the sufficient thing was. He was a man who lit fires in rooms before the person who would benefit from the fire arrived, and left the library open and stood in doorways and could not find his way to the word for any of it. He went to find Clara. She was in the nursery, and she was holding the bird book, and she looked up at him when he came in with the particular attention she always gave adults. He sat down on the low chair beside the fire, which was too small for him, and he said, "I want to ask you something." She said yes. He said, "Do you remember what you said about your Aunt Eleanor? That she was kind?" Clara said, "He said, Miss Rowe is also kind. I have not been kind in return. I intend to correct that." Clara considered this for a moment. Then she said, "Is she coming back?" He said, "I am going to ask her to." The quarter sessions reception was held, as it had been held for 40 years, in the Harwick Assembly Rooms on the 3rd Wednesday of April. It was not a formal occasion of great ceremony, the quarter sessions itself being a legal matter, the magistrate's business, and the reception in the evening was the county's social occasion layered over the legal machinery, and it was the county's occasion, and the county attended, and that was sufficient. Lady Sophia Pembridge attended. She wore ice blue and stood near the east window, and spoke with a pleasantness that had the quality of a woman who has assessed a situation and found it satisfactorily resolved. Miss Jane Appleton attended. She stood near the door for most of the first hour, and watched the entrance. She was the first person in the room to see the Earl of Harwick arrive. He came in without announcement. He was in his dark navy tailcoat, white cravat, perfectly composed, and he did not stop to speak to anyone who greeted him. He moved through the room with the directness of a man who has decided something and will not be interrupted in its execution. He reached her, Cecily standing near the west wall beside Mrs. Cordelia Whitwell, who was seated in a chair and who had the excellent instincts of a woman who has lived 71 years and understood social occasions thoroughly, and who moved her cane slightly to one side as the Earl arrived. He stopped in front of Cecily. She had known he was in the room. She had known for 30 seconds before he reached her because the room had done the same thing. It always did when he entered a space which was to reorganize itself slightly toward him. She had stood with her spine straight and her hands quiet at her sides, and she had not looked. She looked now. He held out the affidavit. She took it. She read it. It did not take long. The date was there. The signature was there. The seal of Colwell's office was there. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the steady attention he had given everything, all winter, that she had carefully refused to name. He said, "I did not receive that letter. I did not know it had been sent." The arrangement was concluded on the 3rd of January. The betrothal was formally announced on the 14th. He paused. "I could not tell you this in the assembly room. I should have come to you the following morning." "I did not. That failure was mine." She said carefully, "Why are you here now?" He said, "Because the alternative was not acceptable to me." The room was very quiet. The room had been going quiet by degrees for the past 2 minutes, in the way that rooms do when something of consequence is occurring at the west wall. And by the time the Earl spoke, the near half of the assembly had stopped pretending to be engaged in other conversations. Lady Sophia Pembridge across the room had gone very still. The Dowager Lady Harwick, seated near the fireplace, had set down her cup. The Earl said in a voice that was not loud, but that carried in the particular way that voices carry in a quiet room, "Miss Rowe, I have wanted no other, before God or man." 10 words. No more. He extended his hand. She stood with the affidavit in one hand, and the knowledge in the other of what it had cost him to say those words in this room, in front of these people, with the Dowager watching, and Lady Sophia's ice-blue gown, a blot at the edge of her vision. She thought about her father's handwriting. She thought about "choose with your whole heart." She thought about the library fire, burning before she arrived. She thought about Clara with the bird book. She thought about a man who could not find the word for anything he felt, standing in a corridor outside a nursery, unable to leave and unable to stay. She took his hand. The room exhaled. The Dowager Lady Harwick looked at her nephew and his intended with an expression that passed through something she would never name aloud, and arrived at a slightly different kind of quiet. She did not speak. She picked up her cup. Lady Sophia Pembridge said her farewells at the east door a quarter of an hour later, with the immaculate composure of a woman who has made a miscalculation and is prepared to absorb it without public damage. She was, in her own way, doing the only graceful thing available to her. No one in the room said anything about it. Miss Jane Appleton, near the west window, permitted herself a single, quiet breath. Clara was there, at the edge of the upper gallery, with her governess. She had not been expected at an evening reception. The Earl had arranged for it that afternoon, without telling Cecily, which was entirely characteristic of him. Clara stood at the gallery rail in her white dress, with the pale blue sash, and watched the woman below take her guardian's hand, and she held the rail with both hands, and her face had the expression of someone receiving information that changes the shape of a room they have been inside for a long time. The church record was witnessed by the senior magistrate of the county, who had conducted the quarter sessions that afternoon and was still at the reception in his official capacity. The ceremony itself was 3 weeks later at St. Cat. Mary's in Ashcroft, at Cecily's request, because her father had been the vicar there for 22 years, and the walls knew his voice. There were not many people. There did not need to be many. By the time summer came, the library at Ashford Park had been reorganized. Not entirely, as the Earl had particular ideas about the arrangement of books, and Cecily had particular ideas about access to natural light, and they had negotiated this the way they negotiated most things, with considerable precision and occasional silence, and an outcome that satisfied them both. The south window was left unobstructed. The chair by the fire remained where it had always been. Clara's bird books were on the lowest shelf, where she could reach them herself. The Bible was on the mantel. Cecily had taken it from the trunk on the morning she returned to Ashford Park, and she had put it on the mantel in the library where the light would reach it in the afternoons, and the Earl had come in that evening and seen it there, and picked it up and opened it to the inside cover without asking permission, because he was beginning to understand that in certain respects she did not require him to ask. He read her father's handwriting. He stood with the book in his hands for a long moment. She was at the desk with the household accounts, her pen moving steadily. She did not look up. He sat down in the chair by the fire. He began to read aloud, quietly, from where the pages fell open, which was a passage in the margins where her father had written simply, in small letters beside a verse, about faithfulness. "This is what I mean." She put down her pen. Outside, in the July warmth, the stream ran clear along the east bank. In the green shade of the willows, a pair of kingfishers moved above the water, there and gone again. Brilliant as a thought barely formed, at home in the world they had always claimed,